The slap echoed through the private jet. For a moment, the entire cabin fell silent. Sarah's head turned slightly from the impact, her cheek burning where Ryan's hand had struck her. The tablet in her hands trembled for a brief second before she steadied it again. Dozens of eyes turned toward them. No one spoke. No one moved. Ryan Coleman stood over her seat, his expression filled with the careless arrogance of someone who had never been challenged in his life. "What makes you think you belong here?" he said coldly. Sarah slowly looked up at him. She didn't raise her voice. "I was assigned this seat," she replied quietly. Ryan laughed. The sound was sharp and mocking. "Assigned," he repeated. "By who?" "Someone who forgot who runs this company." Several executives sitting nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Everyone on the jet knew Ryan Coleman. As the younger son of the powerful Coleman family, Ryan had grown up surrounded by wealth, influence, and unquestioned authority. His temper and arrogance were legendary inside the company. And to him, Sarah was nothing more than a low-level legal consultant who had forgotten her place. Ryan leaned closer to her. "You people should learn to stay where you belong." Before anyone could react, his hand moved. The slap rang through the cabin. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't argue. She didn't even stand up. Instead, she slowly turned her face back toward him, her expression calm and unreadable. The silence inside the jet grew heavy. Passengers glanced at each other, but no one dared to intervene. Challenging Ryan Coleman was something few people were willing to risk. Ryan watched her for a moment, clearly expecting a reaction. But Sarah simply looked at him. Calm. Composed. Unshaken. After a few seconds, Ryan straightened his expensive jacket and stepped back. "Next time," he said with a dismissive smile, "choose your seat more carefully." Then he turned and walked down the aisle as if nothing important had happened. Gradually, the quiet conversations inside the jet began again. But the tension remained. Sarah slowly adjusted the tablet in her hands. Her cheek still stung, but her expression revealed nothing. No one on the jet understood who she really was. To them, she was just Sarah Carter, a quiet legal consultant temporarily assigned to assist the Coleman Corporation during their annual corporate retreat. Someone unimportant. Someone invisible. And Sarah had spent years making sure it stayed that way. Because the truth about her life would change everything in that cabin. Sarah Carter was the wife of Michael King. And Michael King was sitting only a few feet away. Behind the curtain that separated the main cabin from first class, Michael had witnessed the entire scene. The insult. The arrogance. The slap. From his seat, he had heard every word clearly. Michael King was not an ordinary businessman. He was the head of the King family, a name that carried enormous power in both the corporate world and the shadows behind it. His influence stretched across industries, networks, and alliances that most people would never see. Yet at that moment, he remained perfectly still. His expression revealed nothing. But his eyes had not left the curtain separating him from the woman who had just been humiliated. His wife. Their marriage was a secret. To the public, Michael King was an unmarried man completely devoted to building his empire. Only a handful of people knew the truth. Sarah had chosen to live quietly, working as a legal consultant within the Coleman Corporation while the two powerful families prepared for an important corporate merger. The balance between the Coleman family and the King family was delicate. Revealing their relationship too soon could trigger conflicts that neither side was ready to face. So Sarah endured the humiliation. Not because she was weak, but because she understood the larger game being played. Michael leaned back in his seat. He knew Sarah better than anyone. Silence, in her case, never meant surrender. And when Sarah decided the time was right to act, the consequences would be impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Sarah returned her attention to the documents displayed on her tablet. The corporate retreat ahead was supposed to be routine. Executives, directors, and family members were gathering to discuss the future of the Coleman Corporation, including a possible merger with the powerful King family. As part of the legal team assisting the company during the retreat, Sarah had been reviewing financial records and corporate documents. That was when she noticed something strange. Several financial transfers appeared repeatedly in the company's internal reports. At first glance, the transactions looked normal. But Sarah had spent years studying corporate law and financial structures. The pattern immediately caught her attention. Large amounts of money were moving through companies that seemed loosely connected to the Coleman Corporation. Shell companies. The transactions were carefully hidden within ordinary financial activity. But the pattern was there. Assets were being quietly redirected through those companies. And the scale of the transfers suggested something serious. Someone inside the Coleman Corporation was secretly moving money. If the pattern continued, it could drain significant assets from the company before the planned merger with the King family. Sarah's fingers paused over the screen. She carefully saved copies of the financial records. What began as routine legal work was now turning into something far more dangerous. Someone was committing financial fraud inside the Coleman Corporation. And whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to hide it. Across the jet, Michael King remained silent in first class. He had not stepped in when Ryan struck Sarah. Not yet. But he understood something Ryan did not. The quiet woman he had just humiliated was not powerless. And if Ryan ever discovered the truth about Sarah's identity, the consequences would be far greater than he could imagine. The private jet continued its flight toward the corporate retreat. Most of the passengers believed the incident had already been forgotten. They were wrong. Because the woman Ryan had slapped was already uncovering a hidden scheme inside his own family's corporation. A scheme involving shell companies, stolen assets, and betrayal at the highest level. Before the retreat was over, Sarah Carter would expose the truth. And when she did, the people who once ignored her would finally realize something terrifying. The woman they thought was invisible had been watching everything. And she had all the evidence. By the time the private jet landed, the tension from the incident in the cabin had settled into an uneasy silence. Executives, assistants, and family members stepped off the aircraft one by one, greeted by waiting staff and black vehicles that would transport them to the resort hosting the Coleman Corporation's annual corporate retreat. Sarah walked quietly among them, her tablet still in her hand, her expression calm as if nothing unusual had happened during the flight. Ryan didn't even look in her direction as he spoke loudly with a group of executives ahead of her. To him, the incident on the plane had already been forgotten. To Sarah, it was simply another reminder of how easily people judged someone they believed had no power. The retreat location was a sprawling luxury resort reserved entirely for the Coleman family and their senior executives. Tall glass walls overlooked the ocean, and the entire building radiated wealth and influence. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. The retreat was not only about company discussions. It was also about the future merger between the Coleman Corporation and the powerful King family. For most of the executives present, the merger represented opportunity. For Sarah, it meant something else entirely. It meant watching carefully. She spent most of the afternoon reviewing financial documents in a quiet conference room reserved for the legal team. The more records she examined, the clearer the pattern became. Money was being redirected through multiple shell companies connected to the Coleman Corporation. Each transfer was small enough to avoid suspicion. But together, the numbers told a different story. Large amounts of company assets were quietly disappearing. The shell companies appeared to exist only on paper. Their sole purpose seemed to be moving money out of the corporation without drawing attention. Sarah studied the names attached to the transactions. One name appeared repeatedly. Ryan. The discovery confirmed what her instincts had already begun to suspect. Ryan Coleman was deeply involved in the scheme. Sarah copied the relevant documents and stored them securely. But she knew exposing the truth would require more than suspicion. She needed undeniable proof. As evening approached, the resort's grand dining hall filled with members of the Coleman family and their senior executives. The annual retreat dinner was one of the most formal events of the gathering. Long tables were arranged across the hall beneath elegant chandeliers. The seating arrangements reflected the hierarchy of the corporation. Family members and senior directors sat at the central table. Lower-ranking employees were assigned to tables along the edges of the room. Sarah entered quietly and glanced at the seating chart near the entrance. Her name was listed at one of the side tables. She expected nothing less. Taking her seat among several junior staff members, she listened quietly as conversations filled the room. Across the hall, Ryan laughed loudly with a group of executives. At the central table sat Mrs. Coleman, the matriarch of the Coleman family and Ryan's mother. Her sharp eyes moved across the room as if carefully observing everyone present. Dinner began with polite conversation and formal speeches about the future of the company. But Sarah's attention remained fixed on the documents she had reviewed earlier. The financial trail was too precise to be accidental. Someone had designed the scheme carefully, and Ryan appeared to be at the center of it. Halfway through the meal, Mrs. Coleman's gaze settled on Sarah. Her expression hardened slightly. She leaned toward one of the attendants and whispered something quietly. Moments later, the attendant approached Sarah's table. "Miss Carter," he said politely, "Mrs. Coleman requests that you remain seated here for the rest of the evening." The words sounded courteous, but the message was clear. Sarah was not welcome near the central table. Several people at the nearby tables glanced at her curiously. Sarah slowly set down her fork. For years, she had chosen to remain invisible. But tonight, something had changed. Without a word, she stood. The movement immediately drew attention. Dozens of eyes turned toward her as she walked across the dining hall. The room gradually fell silent. Ryan noticed her first. A smirk appeared on his face. "What does she think she's doing?" he muttered to the person beside him. Sarah stopped beside the central table. Mrs. Coleman looked up at her with open disapproval. "Miss Carter," she said sharply, "your seat is not here." Sarah met her gaze calmly. "I believe this discussion concerns the company's legal matters," Sarah replied evenly. "As a legal consultant assigned to the retreat, I should be seated where those matters are being discussed." The statement caused murmurs to ripple through the room. Mrs. Coleman's expression darkened. "The seating arrangement has already been decided." Sarah remained still. "Then perhaps it should be reconsidered." The quiet confidence in her voice caught everyone's attention. Ryan leaned back in his chair, amused by the confrontation. "Didn't anyone explain the rules to you?" he said mockingly. Sarah didn't look at him. Instead, she calmly pulled out an empty chair at the table and sat down. The entire dining hall froze. For a moment, no one spoke. Mrs. Coleman's face tightened with anger. But before she could say anything, Sarah spoke again. "The merger discussions involve significant legal implications," she said calmly. "If the company expects accurate legal guidance, then the legal consultant should be present." The room remained silent. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances. They understood that her statement was technically correct. Mrs. Coleman studied her carefully. Something about Sarah's calm confidence made it difficult to dismiss her outright. After a long pause, she turned back toward her plate. The message was clear. Sarah could stay. Ryan stared at her with narrowed eyes. For the first time, he seemed slightly irritated. The quiet consultant he had slapped on the plane had just challenged his mother in front of the entire room. But Sarah ignored the tension around her. Her mind was already focused on something far more important. The financial fraud she had discovered was larger than anyone realized. And the deeper she looked, the more dangerous the truth was becoming. Someone inside the Coleman Corporation was draining its assets before the merger with the King family. Ryan was involved. But Sarah had the feeling he wasn't acting alone. As the dinner continued, she quietly observed the people around the table. Every conversation, every reaction, every subtle exchange between executives. Somewhere in that room was the rest of the truth. And Sarah intended to find it. Because once she had all the evidence, everything would change. The people who believed she was powerless would soon discover just how wrong they were. The night after the dinner confrontation, the atmosphere at the corporate retreat felt different. Whispers followed Sarah through the halls of the resort. Some people had seen what happened in the dining hall. Others had only heard fragments of the story. But one thing was certain. Many executives were now paying attention to the quiet legal consultant who had calmly challenged Mrs. Coleman at the main table. Sarah ignored the attention. She returned to the conference room early the next morning and continued reviewing financial records. The deeper she looked, the clearer the pattern became. Money was disappearing from the Coleman Corporation. The shell companies she had identified the previous day appeared again and again in the financial records. Each one had been carefully structured to look legitimate, but their true purpose was obvious. They were draining assets from the company. The timing of the transactions made the situation even more suspicious. Most of the transfers had occurred shortly before the planned merger between the Coleman Corporation and the King family. If the company lost enough assets before the merger, the balance of power between the two families would shift dramatically. Sarah studied the documents closely. Ryan's name appeared repeatedly in connection with the transactions. But the more she analyzed the records, the more she realized something important. Ryan might be involved, but the scheme was too complex for him to have designed alone. Someone else had helped build the system of shell companies. Someone with deeper knowledge of the corporation. Someone powerful. Sarah copied additional records and stored them with the files she had already gathered. She was getting closer to the truth. But as she stepped out of the conference room later that afternoon, her phone vibrated. A message had arrived from an unknown number. For a moment, Sarah simply looked at the screen. Then she opened it. The message contained only a photograph. Her breath slowed as she studied the image. The photo showed her standing beside Michael. It had clearly been taken from a distance, as if someone had been watching them without their knowledge. For a long moment, Sarah didn't move. Very few people knew about her relationship with Michael. The photograph meant only one thing. Someone had discovered their secret. A second message appeared on the screen. No words. Just the image. A warning. Sarah locked her phone and slipped it back into her pocket. Her expression remained calm, but her mind was already working through the possibilities. Whoever had sent the photograph wanted her to know they were watching, which meant someone had been investigating her. That realization led her to another question. Who had hired them? Sarah returned to her room and opened her laptop. If someone had been following her and Michael, they would likely have been hired through private channels. Private investigators often worked quietly for corporations or wealthy individuals who needed information without public attention. Sarah began searching through records connected to corporate investigators who had worked with the Coleman Corporation. One name appeared repeatedly in connection with recent contracts. Beek. The investigator had been hired shortly before the retreat. The timing was not a coincidence. Sarah continued researching the name, reviewing every available record she could find. Beek had a reputation for discreet surveillance and information gathering. The kind of investigator hired when someone needed to uncover secrets. Which meant someone inside the corporation had ordered the investigation. And that person was now using the information as a threat. Sarah leaned back in her chair. If someone had gone to the trouble of hiring a private investigator to watch her, then they were afraid of something she might discover. That only confirmed her suspicions. The financial fraud she had uncovered was much larger than it first appeared. Ryan's involvement was only part of the story. Someone else was protecting the scheme. Someone powerful enough to hire an investigator and monitor her movements. Sarah closed the laptop slowly. If they were watching her, then she needed to move carefully. But she would not stop. The evidence she had already collected was too important. And the truth behind the fraud was beginning to take shape. Later that evening, Sarah walked through the resort's quiet corridors toward one of the smaller conference rooms. Several executives were gathered there for informal discussions about the upcoming corporate summit that would take place the next day. The summit was expected to bring together senior members of the Coleman Corporation along with representatives connected to the King family. For most people at the retreat, the summit was simply another step toward finalizing the merger. For Sarah, it represented something far more significant. It was the moment when the truth could finally be revealed. She entered the room quietly and took a seat near the back. Ryan stood near the center of the room, speaking confidently to several directors about the company's future. His tone carried the same arrogance she had seen on the jet. To everyone else, he appeared calm and in control. But Sarah now understood the reality behind that confidence. Ryan had been secretly moving money through shell companies. And someone else had been helping him hide it. As the discussion continued, Sarah observed the people in the room carefully. Some faces showed curiosity when they noticed her. Others avoided looking at her altogether. She wondered which of them knew about the scheme. And which of them were involved. When the meeting ended, most of the executives began leaving the room. Ryan remained behind, speaking briefly with one of the directors. For a moment, his eyes met Sarah's across the room. There was something different in his expression now. Not the casual arrogance from the plane. Something more cautious. Perhaps he had begun to realize that she was not as insignificant as he once believed. But Ryan said nothing. He turned and walked out of the room without another glance. Sarah stayed seated for several seconds after the room emptied. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. The financial records. The shell companies. The threatening photograph. The investigator named Beek. Someone inside the corporation was desperate to keep the fraud hidden. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed Sarah would remain silent. Tomorrow's summit would bring the most powerful members of the corporation together in one room. And when that happened, Sarah would finally reveal the truth. The people who believed they controlled the situation were about to discover something they had never expected. The quiet legal consultant they had ignored was already holding the evidence that could destroy everything they had built. All that remained was the right moment to expose it. The corporate summit began with an air of calm professionalism, but beneath the polished smiles and handshakes, tension simmered. Executives from the Coleman Corporation, family members, and key representatives from the King family gathered in the Grand Hall, the walls lined with polished wood panels and crystal chandeliers reflecting the soft light. Every seat was filled, every face attentive, and every conversation carefully controlled. Sarah entered the hall with a quiet confidence. She carried her tablet, loaded with every piece of evidence she had meticulously collected. Documents, transaction logs, and shell company records filled the device, along with a clear timeline showing who had orchestrated the financial fraud. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a quiet fire. This was the moment she had prepared for, the moment when the truth would finally emerge. She walked down the aisle, past rows of curious eyes and whispered speculation, and took her place at the front of the hall. Murmurs rippled through the room as people recognized her presence. Some remembered the dinner confrontation. Others had heard stories about the incident on the private jet. Now, all attention was on Sarah, the quiet consultant who had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Michael King sat nearby, discreetly observing. His presence was both a shield and a signal. While no one at the summit yet knew the full extent of his relationship with Sarah, his watchful gaze made it clear that she had support beyond what anyone could suspect. Sarah began to speak. Her voice was steady, precise, and commanding. She presented the evidence piece by piece, showing how Ryan Coleman had used multiple shell companies to siphon assets from the corporation in the months leading up to the merger. She explained the transactions clearly, mapping them in a way that left no room for doubt. The murmurs grew louder as executives and family members realized the scale of the deception. Then she revealed something no one expected. With a quiet, deliberate tone, Sarah stated her true identity. She was not just a legal consultant. She was Michael King's wife, and she had been working on behalf of the King family all along. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Faces went pale. Conversations stopped. The whispers turned to stunned silence. The impact of her statement was immediate. Ryan's confident demeanor faltered. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure how to respond. Director Harris, a trusted member of Michael's team, stiffened in his seat. He had helped orchestrate parts of the scheme, and now the evidence was indisputable. Sarah continued. She outlined how the fraud had not only threatened the merger but had a far deeper purpose. The ultimate target had been the King Family Foundation, a cornerstone of Michael's empire, and the entire scheme had been orchestrated by Michael's own uncle. The betrayal ran deeper than anyone had anticipated, implicating members of both families who had thought themselves untouchable. The room was tense. Executives whispered among themselves, directors exchanged nervous glances, and Mrs. Coleman sat rigidly, her face a mixture of shock and fury. The quiet legal consultant, who had once been dismissed as insignificant, now held the fate of the corporation and two powerful families in her hands. Security and law enforcement, already present discreetly due to the high-profile nature of the summit, began moving quietly as Sarah presented the final pieces of evidence. Ryan Coleman and Director Harris were both arrested within the hour. The culmination of years of secret planning had been undone by the careful work of one woman who refused to be invisible. As the arrests were carried out, Sarah felt a wave of relief. The weight of secrecy, of danger, and of hidden manipulation was lifting. Michael joined her quietly, his presence both comforting and affirming. Together, they surveyed the room, which now contained stunned executives, apprehended conspirators, and witnesses to the complete unraveling of the fraud. With the immediate threat neutralized, Sarah and Michael turned their attention to rebuilding. The King Family Foundation was intact, and the merger could proceed on a legitimate basis. The corporate retreat, once a setting for betrayal and manipulation, had now become a place of resolution and clarity. For Sarah, the victory was more than professional. It was personal. She had endured humiliation, threats, and hidden observation, yet she had remained steadfast. The woman who had been slapped on a private jet, ignored at formal dinners, and threatened with exposure now stood at the center of power, her competence and courage recognized by those who had underestimated her. Michael took her hand as they walked through the resort's corridors, away from the whispers and stares of executives. They discussed plans for strengthening the family foundation, ensuring that such a scheme could never be attempted again. And in the quiet moments between discussions of corporate strategy and family security, they began to talk about starting a family of their own, symbolizing a new chapter of trust, unity, and hope. Sarah had entered the retreat as an invisible consultant. She had faced threats, humiliation, and hidden eyes watching her every move. By the end, she had exposed a complex scheme of betrayal, asserted her rightful place in two powerful families, and forged a future built on truth and justice. The story of the quiet legal consultant and the powerful mafia boss, once hidden in shadows and secrets, ended with clarity, justice, and the promise of new beginnings. Sarah had stepped into her power, no longer invisible, standing beside the man who had once loved her in secret. Together, they faced the future openly, ready to build a life and a legacy that could withstand any challenge.